Somewhere in southern Chile, a team was clearing wet black peat when the brush caught on wood. Not roots, cut wood. Stakes still standing after 14,000 years, holding the outline of shelters, hearths, and a child's footprint pressed into clay. The problem wasn't that it was old, the problem was where it sat, at the bottom of two continents, thousands of miles from where the first Americans were supposed to have entered, and older than the people who were supposed to be first. For decades, the safe answer was that sites like this were wrong. This was only the first crack. The place is called Monte Verde, a creek bank in a cold, boggy corner of Chile, about 30 miles from the Pacific. Excavations began there in 1976, led by an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay. And what came out of the ground was not a scatter of stone chips. It was a place people had lived. Wooden foundations of a long structure divided into rooms, clay-lined fire pits, animal bone, plant remains, including chewed seaweed hauled up from the coast, a footprint left by a child in soft ground that then hardened and waited. None of that survives normally. It survived because a peat bog rolled over the camp and sealed it in oxygen-starved mud, the kind of airless grave that stops wood from rotting and keeps a meal recognizable for millennia. And then came the number. The occupation dated to roughly 14,500 years ago. That does not sound shocking until you understand the wall it hit. For most of the 20th century, the answer to who were the first Americans was fixed. They were the Clovis people, named for distinctive fluted stone spear points first found near Clovis, New Mexico. The story was clean. Big game hunters crossed from Siberia during the Ice Age, waited for a gap to open between two enormous ice sheets, walked south through that ice-free corridor around 13,000 years ago, and spread across an empty hemisphere. Firmly dated Clovis sits around 13,000 years. That was the baseline. That was the floor. It was not a stupid idea. It was built from the evidence people actually had, and it held for generations. But a clean story has a way of becoming more than a theory. It becomes textbooks. It becomes careers. It becomes the thing every graduate student learns to defend. And once a story is that load-bearing, changing it feels less like science and more like an attack. Now put Monte Verde against that wall, 14,500 years at the far southern end of South America. To be there by then, people had to have entered the continent, traveled the entire length of two landmasses, and settled in, all before the door in the north was supposedly even open. One southern site quietly made the whole northern story too small, so the field did what fields do with evidence that arrives too early. It doubted, and the doubt was not gentle. Pre-Clovis claims had a long history of being dismissed as contamination, as disturbed layers, as sloppy digging, as wishful thinking. There were reasons. Old sites had collapsed under scrutiny before, but the reasons hardened into a wall, and the wall had a side effect. It made the researcher, not the model, into the risk. Dillahay was not just arguing for a date. He was arguing against the shape of an entire discipline, and for years, the safer bet for everyone else was that he was wrong. Then, something rare happened. In 1997, a group of prominent skeptics flew to Chile to inspect Monte Verde in person. They came to break it. Instead, they signed off on it. The main occupation layer was real, and it was pre-Clovis. Textbooks were rewritten. The wall had a hole in it. But the field did not apologize. It adjusted, it absorbed the new date and moved on as if the fight had been a polite academic disagreement instead of a decades-long refusal. And here is what almost nobody said out loud at the time. If one site could break the wall was never as solid as everyone had insisted. Which raised a colder question. Was Monte Verde alone? It was not, because Monte Verde itself was not done. Below and around the accepted layer sat other traces, deeper and far more contested. A lower component, sometimes called Monte Verde Warn, produced stones and possible hearths with dates running past 30,000 radiocarbon years. And later, work at the site and at a nearby locality called Chinchihuapi turned up more. In 2015, Dillahay's team published evidence of scattered, low-density human activity, burned features, stone, bone, spread through a window that reached from around 14,500 back toward possibly 19,000 years. Now, be honest about this, The main 14,500 year layer is solid. The deeper stuff is genuinely disputed, thin, ambiguous, the kind of evidence critics are right to poke. But notice the pattern. One anomaly is a mistake. The same site producing older and older dates across different excavations, decade after decade, is not a mistake anymore. It is pressure. And then the map moved, hard and to the north. In New Mexico, in the gypsum flats of White Sands, researchers found something that did not need a lab to feel real. Footprints, human footprints, pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore and then buried. Not one or two, trackways. And when they were dated, the number was worse than Monte Verde. Between about 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Look at what that means. 23,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, the coldest, iciest peak of the last ice age. The ice-free corridor wasn't open, it was ice. The clean migration route the whole model depended on physically could not have carried anyone south at that time. And yet here were people in the middle of the continent walking across a wetland beside giant ground sloths and mammoths. The footprints are the part you can't argue away in your gut. A date on a bone is abstract. This is a person. In one trackway, someone appears to have carried a small child, setting them down, picking them up, the toddler's prints flickering in and out beside the adults. A rescued moment of a real day, 23,000 years old. The footprint lasted longer than the person who made it. Of course, the field pushed back, and the objection was clever. The original dates came from seeds of an aquatic plant, Ruppia. Aquatic plants can pull in old carbon dissolved in the water, which could make a radiocarbon date read far older than the thing actually is. It was a reasonable objection. It was also exactly the kind of objection that protects an old model. If the seeds were bad, the whole thing went away. So a team led by geologist Vance Holliday went back. And instead of dating the seeds, they dated everything else. Terrestrial pollen from the same layers, ancient lakebed mud, quartz grains using a completely different method, optically stimulated luminescence. That has nothing to do with carbon at all. They sent samples to independent labs. Same answer, same window. Around 21 to 23,000 years. They tested it a different way and it came back the same. Then they tested it a third way, and it came back the same again. That is the moment an objection stops being a rescue and starts being a problem. The wall had no comfortable edge left. And once you accept people at White Sands during the ice peak, the old route detonates. If they were already deep in the continent when the corridor was sealed shut, they didn't come through the corridor. So how did they get here? The field reached for a lifeline it had spent years mocking. The coast. The idea that the first Americans didn't march through the interior at all but hugged the Pacific shoreline, moving south along a rich edge of kelp forests, seals, fish, and shellfish, a kelp highway that let boats and small groups leapfrog down the coast while the interior was still frozen. For a long time, saying that out loud was close to career suicide. There was no site to point to. Then the interior dates got old enough that the coastal route stopped being fringe and started being the only thing that fit. The evidence didn't win an argument. It survived long enough that the field got uncomfortable enough to move. But here's the cruel twist in the coastal story. You can barely dig it. Because the Ice Age coastline these people would have walked is gone. When the glaciers melted, the sea rose, and the ancient shoreline is now sitting under 100 meters or more of ocean. Every camp, every hearth, every landing spot along that route is drowned. So when critics said for decades that there was no evidence for early coastal migration, they were half right and half trapped. Maybe the first Americans didn't leave little evidence. Maybe we've been standing on the wrong beach the entire time, digging inland while the real story sank. And this is where the argument stops being careful and gets dangerous. Because there is a site that makes everything you just heard look conservative. In San Diego, during a freeway expansion back in 1992, paleontologists recovered the broken bones of a mastodon. Nothing strange about that. What was strange was how they were broken. Spiral fractures of the kind you get when bone is smashed while it's still fresh, clustered around large stones that look like hammers and anvils, some with impact wear. In 2017, in the journal Nature, The team led by Tom Demir and Steve Holin made the claim out loud. This was a site where humans processed a mastodon, and the bone dated by uranium series methods to around 130,000 years ago. Sit with that number. Not 13,000, not 23,000, 130,000. That is older than our own species is thought to have been anywhere near the Americas. That is a number that doesn't bend the timeline, it snaps it. So let me be completely clear, because this is where honesty matters most. Most archaeologists do not accept the Kurudi Mastodon site. The criticisms are serious. Heavy construction equipment was working right above it and could have cracked the bones. Nature breaks stones and bones too. The uranium date is for the bone, not for any proven human presence. This is not proof of anyone in California 130,000 years ago, and it should not be sold as such. But watch what happened, not whether it's true. The moment the claim appeared, the field mobilized to kill it fast and hard. And you don't have to believe Cerruti to notice something uncomfortable in that reaction. Once the old wall had already fallen at Monte Verde, once footprints had appeared at the ice peak, the reflex to instantly crush an extreme claim looked less like caution and more like a discipline that had learned exactly how much it hates being surprised. Then the story moved somewhere no shovel can reach, into blood. When geneticists sequenced ancient and living Native American genomes, most of the picture fit the expected story, a founding population out of Siberia. But buried in the data was something that would not sit still. A faint, strange signal in some Amazonian groups, peoples like the Surui and Caritiana, that matched more closely to indigenous Australians and Melanesians, populations from the other side of the planet. Researchers labeled the ghost behind it Population Y. Nobody serious is claiming a lost civilization sailed from Australia, but the signal is real, it is published, and it is still argued over. And what it does to the clean story is quiet and devastating. The peopling of the Americas was not one tidy wave of one tidy people walking through one tidy gap. The bones said earlier, the footprints said impossible, and the DNA said more than one story. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. Monte Verde, the deeper Chilean layers, white sands at the ice peak, a drowned coastal route, a ghost in the genome. Each one, on its own, could be doubted, and each one was. Contamination, disturbance, bad seeds, broken equipment, statistical noise. Every single objection was individually reasonable. Together, they stop looking like caution and start looking like a pattern, a field reaching for whatever answer let the old map survive one more year. And this was never a conspiracy. There was no secret meeting, no buried file, no villain. It was something more ordinary and more dangerous. It was inertia. It was reputation. It was the simple fact that the people who built their careers on the clean version were the same people reviewing the papers that threatened it. No one had to hide anything. Doubt did the work for free. It was not a lie. It was a discipline defending the shape of what it already knew. So let's be fair about what we actually have, because the drama is real, but the honesty has to be too. What is established? People were in the Americas well before Clovis. Clovis-first, as a theory, is dead. That's not fringe anymore, that's the textbook. What is genuinely debated? Exactly how early? The 23,000-year White Sands date is powerful but not universally accepted. The coastal route is likely but hard to prove while it's underwater. The genetic ghost is real but unexplained. And what is speculative and mostly rejected, Cerruti's 130,000 years, sitting out at the dangerous edge of the argument as a reminder of how far the debate can now stretch. The old model wasn't foolish. It was built from the evidence of its time. It was just defended too hard, for too long, past the point where the evidence deserved it. And when it finally gave way, it didn't give way with an apology. It gave way in softer textbook sentences and quietly redrawn maps. The retreat happened in the footnotes. And then, right as the news story seemed to settle, the ground moved again, back at the site where it all started. Because in 2026, a new independent team returned to Monte Verde for the first serious outside look in nearly 50 years. And they came back arguing the impossible. that Monte Verde isn't 14,500 years old at all, that it might be mid-Holocene, only around 4,000 to 8,000 years old. Their case, much of the dated wood was old Ice Age material, redeposited by water long after the fact, and a layer of 11,000-year-old volcanic ash sits below the occupation, when it should sit above it if the site were truly that ancient. Not everyone accepts that reversal either. The debate is live and unfinished as you watch this, but notice what it proves, regardless of who's right. The same doubt machine that spent decades refusing to let Monte Verde be old is now running in reverse, refusing to let it stay old. The certainty never went away. It just changed direction, and the site that once broke the entire timeline is now the one under the knife. Here's what won't move, no matter how that fight ends. White Sands still stands. The other pre-Clovis sites still stand. Clovis-first is still dead. The story is still older and messier than the clean version ever allowed. But if we can't even agree on the age of the single most famous site in the whole argument, then think about how much of the real story we've never touched. Sealed under peat in a Chilean bog, pressed into gypsum in a New Mexico flat, and most of it, probably, drowned along a coastline that no archaeologist can dig, a shoreline underwater and out of reach while a tide rolls in over the footprints we'll never find. The old story was too small. The retreat happened quietly, and the ground is still arguing.